I recently had the opportunity to give a live presentation on the topic of God's existence at Christendom College, one of the most Catholic schools in America. And because this presentation was a good opportunity for me to summarize some of the research that I've been doing on the topic of God's existence that I've been presenting on this channel, I want to share this footage from this presentation with you so you can get a sense of how I synthesize the different ideas that I've been talking about in my different videos and bring it all together. Before I show that footage though, I want to give two quick caveats. First, and this is kind of the necessary legal disclaimer, I want to point out that what I'm about to say in this video is not intended to express the views of Christendom College as an institution in any capacity. I am not a professor working for Christendom. Matter of fact, I'm a student there. And this presentation was in part done for classwork. And the professor, as far as I could tell, liked the presentation. So he may have agreed with it. He probably did, but he may not have. So I just want to put that out there and say that what I say in this presentation may or may not reflect the official views of Christendom College. Okay. My second caveat, well, the audio to the video got a little messed up, and I tried to restore it as best I could, but it still isn't that great. So I'm encouraging you, if you're going to watch this video, to watch it attentively so you can best understand what I'm trying to say, even with the bad audio. With that, I hope you enjoy. I think I want to start by defining the main term of my presentation, which is, of course, God. You can't answer whether God exists unless you first define God. And in this presentation, I'm defining God as the God of classical theism. And the God of classical theism, at its core, is understood as a being who is infinite being itself. He is a pure act of existence, an act of being. So God equals being itself. And from this understanding of God as being itself, a whole host of other conclusions follow. So it follows, for example, that if God is being itself, there could only be one God. Because God, if he's being itself, could not lack any kind of being. And the only way that you could ever have more than one of a specific kind of being is if one of them has some kind of being that another one lacks. So if you have a being which does not lack any being, there can only ever be one such being. So God, if he exists, must be singular under classical theism. It also follows that God, if he exists, must be all good. Because goodness and being are interchangeable. A thing is good to the extent that it is being. So God, if he exists under classical theism, is all good. Similarly, he also must be all powerful, because power is just being putting itself into action. So God is all powerful for the classical theist. And more than that, he is all knowing, because knowledge is simply being as grasped by the intellect. So God is, so far, being itself, who is singular, all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful. But there's more we could say about God. We could say, for example, that he must be unchanging. Because to change is to gain some kind of being or to lose some kind of being. And if this being can't lack any being, it can't lose being or gain being. So God is unchanging and unchangeable. Okay? And from this understanding of God as unchanging, it also follows that he must be perfectly simple. He must not be comprised of any composite parts. Because if he was comprised of parts, those parts could be separated and put back together. And that would make up a change. So he's perfectly simple. Perfectly simple. And if God is perfectly simple, he must be immaterial, because matter is necessarily made of parts. You can always take any quantity of matter, and like I can take this podium and I can divide it in half, that's a change. I can divide those halves again in another half, that'll be another change. You can always divide matter into further and further smaller quantities. So God is immaterial. Sorry, yes, he's immaterial. He's not made up of matter. He also must be timeless because it's unchanging, because time is a measure of change. God, if he exists, also must be the creator of all that is, because if God is being itself, he must exist and sustain being everything which has being. If anything has being, God, as being itself, if he exists, will be found in that thing. So God is a creator under this understanding, and he also is an immanent creator, because he's found in everything which he creates. So God, we have immanent. But he's also, of course, not contained by his creation, because he's infinite. Oh, I didn't put that that way. God is infinite. He's not made up of, he's not finite. To be finite is to have a limit, and God, as being itself, must not have a limit, because then there would be some being which lacked. So God is, in addition to all these other attributes, he is extra creation. He's outside of the created world. Extra creation. So far, we have arrived at the existence, well, we haven't arrived at the existence of being, but if God exists, we have arrived at the conclusion that he must be according to the classical theist, a singular, all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing, unchanging, perfectly simple, immaterial, timeless creator who is immanent and extra creation. And because he's all-knowing, he must also be personal. So that is how we're defining God for the purpose of this presentation. Now, let's look at some reasons why God might not exist. The first, I'm going to call the problem of superfluous evil. And some of you might find that kind of interesting, because you've probably heard of something called the problem of evil before. And the reason I want to talk about the specific version of the problem of evil is I think a lot of atheists are actually starting to move away from the more generic problem of evil, because they are starting to realize that Christians and other theists have, for centuries, had a pretty good response to the purely logical problem of evil. But to kind of see why that is, and also to set up what I'm going to talk about when I'm talking about the problem of superfluous evil, I want to outline first what the problem of evil is. Just give me 1 second. The problem of evil takes a shot at these three attributes of God right here, and says that they are incompatible with the existence of evil. There could not be, according to the proponent of the problem of evil, a being who is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, and there still exists evil. The reason for this is that if God is all good, he would have the desire to prevent all evil. If he was all powerful, he would have the power, the ability to prevent all evil. And if he was all knowing, he would know wherever evil exists. So, if God is all good, he would have power, or if all good, all knowing, and all powerful, he would both have the power and the desire to prevent all evil. So there should not be any evil in a world created by a God who is all good, all knowing, and all powerful. Yet there is evil in the world. Therefore, the proponent of the classical logical problem of evil concludes God does not exist. The classical Christian response to this is to say that there is no logical contradiction between the existence of God and the existence of evil. Because it could be the case that an all-good God could allow some kind of evil to exist in order to bring about greater good, which could not exist without that evil. Classic example of this is the good of compassion. To have compassion means to suffer with compassion. So it would not be possible to have compassion without suffering. You could not have compassion without passion, without being able to feel pain along with other people. So there are certain goods which are contingent for their existence upon the existence of evil. Therefore, it is at least conceivably possible that a good God would allow the existence of evil and still have good as his intention. So a lot of atheists and proponents of the problem of evil have realized that that's a good response. Maybe they say there isn't a logical contradiction between the existence of God and the existence of evil per se. But, they'll argue, maybe the sheer amount and the type of evil that we find in this world still, if not absolutely, probabilistically suggests that God does not exist. Because we look around the world and we see so much evil, and we see evil of a kind that doesn't seem to have a direct connection to some kind of good resulting from that evil. So the classic example of this is the existence of animal suffering. If you have, say, a deer in a forest, and the tree falls on the deer, and let's say it doesn't kill the deer right away, but it gradually falls further and further and further on the deer and slowly kind of pushes it into the ground. So this deer dies this excruciating, agonizing death. That would be incredibly painful for that deer. And the proponent of this problem would say that's a kind of evil that doesn't seem to have a direct connection to any good, which could follow from it. After all, no human beings could see that. Like, there could be an event like that, but no human beings see. So we don't feel passion for that deer or anything like that. It's just the deer off by itself in the wilderness, experiencing pain with no apparent reason. And then you realize that in the grand course of history, human beings have existed for like that much of the timeline of history, if the timeline of history is that long. I mean, if animals have existed for this long, human beings have existed for a very, very small amount of the time that animals existed, which seems to suggest that for the vast amount of history, millions and millions of animals were experiencing agonizing deaths like the one just described without any human beings deriving any kind of good from it. It seems, therefore, that even if there's no logical contradiction between the existence of evil and the existence of God, there are certain kinds of evils, like that one, which we would not expect if theism was true. Therefore, it is most likely the case that God does not exist. My second objection is a similar one. It's also a variant of the problem of evil. This time, it's the problem of God's hiddenness, of divine hiddenness. And this objection says that if God existed, if an all-good God existed specifically, he would want his creatures to have the opportunity to come to know him, because he's goodness himself. And I agree with this. If God is goodness himself, and he wants the best for his creatures, then it stands to reason that he would want his creatures to come to know him and to be united with him, because that's the final end. The problem is, it seems like there have been many people throughout history who, through no fault of their own, have never had the opportunity to get to know God. So, a classic example of this would be people who lived in the Americas before 1492, before the coming of the Christians. Many of these people lived in, actually all of them, lived in polytheistic pagan cultures, and they never had any notion of the God of classical theism. They didn't have the benefit of Christian missionaries or ancient Greek philosophy. They had nothing. All they had was their own intellect, and they weren't able to arrive at the existence. So, this argument says, what's going on here? Why would God create people like that and not give them a way to come to know him? The second example that's sometimes brought up for the problem of divine hiddenness is the example of an honest atheist, of someone who is sincerely intellectually convinced that God does not exist. That person may have just encountered bad arguments for God and, through no fault of his own, assumed that those were the only arguments that were. He may have just made an intellectual mistake. He may just have been convinced by some famous atheist rhetoric, rhetorical style, and intellectually been convinced God must not exist. It seems like that person is at no moral fault for his non-belief, but yet God is allowing that person to not have the opportunity to come to know him. Those are, I think, the two of the strongest arguments against God's existence. Now, I would like to turn to two of what I think are the strongest arguments in favor of the existence of God. And these two arguments, I want to point out beforehand, are not the only arguments for God's existence. In fact, I think there are many arguments out there, and I actually think the best argument for God, for many people, will be a kind of cumulative case, where you take the best arguments for God and you kind of put them on top of each other. And it will be like you have a bucket with a hole in it, and you put another bucket with a hole in it on top of it so that it covers up some of that hole. And then you put another bucket on top. Eventually you'll get a whole bucket. But I do think some arguments for God can stand on their own. And today I want to talk about two of those arguments. The first is Aquinas' de ante argument. And this, I think, will be an argument very familiar to most Christendom students. Let me write that up here. De ante. This argument starts with the premise that there exists in things a distinction between their essence and existence, between what they are and the fact that they are. So, how can I illustrate this? Well, imagine that you in your life had never seen a single animal before. All you had seen were human beings. And you went up to me and you said, "Oh, Thomas, I'm wondering what an animal is like. Can you tell me about some types of animals?" And I described for you three kinds of animals. First, I described for you a dog. I said, a dog is a smallish, kind of furry animal that has ears, and it chases its tail sometimes, and it really doesn't like squirrels. Like it'll chase them in the trees. And he said, all right, I now understand what a dog is. And then I said, okay, here's another kind of animal, a Tyrannosaurus Rex. A Tyrannosaurus Rex is like a big lizard. I guess you don't know what a lizard is because you've never seen an animal. But it's like, imagine a lizard, but it's just bigger. And it's got a long tail, and it's got tiny arms, and it likes to eat other animals. Like it's got big, giant teeth. And he said, all right, now I understand what a Tyrannosaurus Rex is. And then I proposed for you a third kind of animal. I said, a unicorn is like this kind of longish animal with legs, and it's got a tail, and it's got a horn, and maybe I drew even a picture for you. I drew like a picture that kind of looks like that. This is the unicorn. And you now have, based on this picture and my description, an idea of what a unicorn is in your head. You understand the essence of a unicorn. You also understand the essence of a dog, which I'm not going to try to draw for you, and a Tyrannosaurus Rex, which I'm definitely not going to try to draw. And because of this, you could, if you ever happen to see any of these creatures on the street, point them out to me. You could say, that's a unicorn, that's a T-Rex, that's a dinosaur. However, you still have no idea which of these animals actually exist. You have no idea, for example, that a dog is an animal that used to exist but doesn't anymore. I said that wrong. That a dog is an animal that still exists and has existed for a while. That a Tyrannosaurus Rex is an animal which used to exist but hasn't existed for billions of years. And that a unicorn is an animal which has never existed in the history of humanity. You would have no idea. That shows that there is a difference between the essence of a thing, the whatness of a thing, and the fact that a thing exists. And it just so happens that whenever a thing exists in the real world, the essence of the thing and existence are put together. That essence has existence. This raises a question. How is it that anything has its essence given existence? I think there's three basic options. First, there could be no reason why a thing which exists has its essence given existence. But this is intellectually unsatisfying because it violates what we call the principle of sufficient reason, which says that for everything which exists, there exists a reason why it exists as it does. And if we throw out the principle of sufficient reason, we have no way to have knowledge, because knowledge presupposes that things exist for reasons. Okay? The second option is that this thing is responsible for giving itself existence. But this too doesn't work, because in order to give yourself existence, you would first have to have existence. Because you can only give something if you already have it. If I wanted to give one of my friends here a $100 bill, I'd have to have a $100 bill in my wallet. If I didn't have it, I couldn't give it. In the same way, if something didn't already have existence, it couldn't give existence. So, and of course, if something already has existence, it doesn't need to be given existence in the first place. So, it can't be something which already nothing can give itself existence. That is an impossibility. The third option, which I think is the correct one, is that something is given existence by something outside of itself. Whenever you have a distinction in the thing between its essence and its existence must be given to its essence by something outside of itself. There's two questions to ask there. First, is it given its existence by something far in the past? Is it the case that this podium only exists right now because this is a bad example because podiums don't have essences? But is it the case that I only exist right now because 22 years ago my parents combined my essence and existence? Well, no, because that might explain how my essence was first given existence, but it doesn't explain how my essence and existence have been sustained in this conjunction for the last 22 years. What is the explanation for why my essence and existence are together right now? Well, maybe it could be something who has its own distinction between its essence and its existence. Okay, that's satisfying at first, but then you have to ask, what's combining that thing's essence and existence? If this is me, and I have this distinction between essence and existence, distinction, essence, and existence, and I am given, my essence is given existence by something else which has this distinction between essence and existence, you have to ask, well, what's giving this thing its existence? And that just brings the question back. If it's another thing which has this distinction between its essence and its existence, you have to ask the same question again. And this could, in theory, go back to infinity. But it can't go back to infinity. Why, you ask? Well, because, first of all of this is happening in a single moment. And there needs to be, let's look at this thing right here. This is existence, right? That's what I define. If existence is in this formula, there must be something putting it in this whole situation. So you have one thing giving its existence to another thing, giving existence to another thing. All of these things have existence through another. This is not possible unless there is something whose very nature is existence that they're passing back and forth between each other. This thing, I would suggest, if it exists, must be God. And we've shown that it must exist because if this was all there is, if at every moment in the past, everything in existence, perhaps I didn't explain this more earlier, so let me try again. If everything in existence was being given its existence by something else who had a distinction between its essence and existence, then you would not this is always the hardest part of it to explain because it's so technical. But basically it comes down to the fact that all these things are deriving their existence from that first thing. And they're deriving it in such a way that they don't have the power in themselves to produce existence. No essence has the power in itself to produce existence, so there must be something which just is existence, something whose essence is existence, to put existence in this whole system of things, to introduce existence and sustain everything in this presently occurring causal system in existence. And this thing, I would suggest, must be God, because if its essence is existence, then it fulfills the definition of the classical theistic God. It's being itself. So that is the de ante argument in a nutshell. Now I just want to kind of quickly run you through the second argument that I think is quite strong. And I'm not going to say that this is the second strongest argument for God or anything. It's just one that's near and dear to my heart because I worked at it on my senior thesis. And I actually think that the version of this argument that I'm going to present today is somewhat original. And this would be the argument for morality. So the argument for morality, in its core form, suggests that if moral facts exist, God must exist. And there have been many different versions of this argument proposed throughout history, but like I said, this version is, as far as I can tell, more or less original. But it's not original because it's drawn from Thomistic principles and it's drawn from other versions of the argument. But it starts by assuming, more or less, that there is a distinction in things between, or sorry, I put some water for a second, sorry. Keeps the brain flowing. I don't think brain flows, but keeps the brain. Okay, so the argument for morality. Let's start by making a somewhat controversial assumption, but really not that controversial, which is that objective moral facts exist. In my thesis, I do give a little argument for the idea that objective moral facts exist, but I'm not going to do this today because the vast majority of people in the world believe in objective moral facts. They believe, for example, that it is always wrong to kill innocent people for fun. They believe that that is a true claim. So, broadly speaking, you don't need to defend it. So let's assume that's the case. I'm going to show how that entails the existence of God. Let's see why that is. You see, if objective moral facts exist, then there is a hierarchy of moral good actions. Because objective moral facts show that some actions are better than others. For example, it is a true statement that it is always a good thing to, let me try to rank for you hierarchically some objectively morally good actions. Let's take the action of rushing into a burning building to save a family of children. So, burning building. I think everyone under normal circumstances would look at that and say, that is a enormously heroic action. Second, you have the scenario of someone going to the supermarket and buying food for his family. So, supermarket. I think most people will look at that and say, okay, assuming that there isn't something else going on, that is an extremely morally good action. But it's not, sorry, not extreme. It is a morally good action, but it's not extremely morally good, like rushing into the burning building. But let's take a third option. Let's take killing your next door neighbor for fun. Murder. Neighbor. Murder. What we see here is there's a hierarchy of goodness in actions. Some actions are really good. Some actions are a little less good, but still good. And some actions are just downright evil. What this shows is both that there's a hierarchy in moral actions, but there's also, I would suggest, a hierarchy in the moral morality of human beings because of this hierarchy of morality and actions. Because human beings are good insofar as their actions are good. Actions are what make human beings good. So if a human being goes through his whole life always performing heroic deeds like this one, he will be an extremely morally good person. And if he does like an occasional good deed like that, but also like an occasional bad deed like that, and he spends most of his life just kind of doing normal things, he's a little less up on the heroic hierarchy, but he's still a good person. And if he commits a murder every other Tuesday, he's not a good person. So there's a hierarchy of goodness in human beings. What I will suggest now is that wherever equality exists in things hierarchically, it must exist in that thing imperfectly. For example, it is not possible for a triangle to have the quality of having three sides hierarchically. It is not possible for one triangle to have three sides more than another triangle, because having three sides is necessary to being a triangle. You can't be a triangle without having three sides. Similarly, being alive is, I would suggest, necessary to being human. You can't not be alive and not be human. Wait, you can't not be alive and still be human, because then you'd be a corpse. So, wherever equality exists in a thing hierarchically, it exists in it imperfectly. So that's why I would suggest that you can't have three-sidedness in triangles hierarchically. It either has it or it doesn't. And you can't have being alive in human beings hierarchically. A human being either has it or it doesn't. Wherever equality exists in a thing, it agrees it exists imperfectly. Second, I would suggest that whenever equality exists in a thing imperfectly, that quality exists in a thing in such a way that that thing is deriving that quality from something which has that thing perfectly and through itself. So let's see what this looks like practically. Let's say that, I have a good example for this, it's slipping my mind. Well, let's take the example of this marker. I would say the ink in this marker has being black through its very nature, because there's no way to separate the blackness of this ink and have it still be black. In the same way, being a triangle has three-sidedness by its nature, because there's no way to separate having three sides from a triangle and have it not still be a triangle. Human beings are not like that when it comes to goodness. Human beings have some qualities through our very nature, like the quality of being alive, or the quality of being human, or being rational. But the quality of goodness can't be like that, because we can lose it, as in the case of the murderer, and still be human. So, it must be the case that moral goodness is not part of our nature. But whenever a thing exists in a way where it's not part of the thing's nature, but it still exists in the thing, given the principle of sufficient reason, that quality must exist dependent upon a thing which has that quality through its very nature, which just in this case has the quality of goodness itself through its very nature. And this thing, which has goodness itself through its very nature, must be God, because as I said here, goodness and being are interchangeable.
So remember those two arguments against the existence of God that I mentioned. The problem of superfluous evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. What I want to suggest is that since both of those arguments are probabilistic, they pale in comparison to the absolute certainty of the two arguments for God that I just gave. In other words, probabilistic arguments are only helpful against other probabilistic arguments. If you have an argument that demonstrates with absolute certainty the conclusion of that argument, no amount of probabilistic arguments against it will ever disprove that argument. And I would suggest that at the absolute least, the de ante argument absolutely proves the existence of God with 100% certainty if the premises are sound. And the argument for morality, for someone who accepts the existence of objective moral facts, absolutely proves the existence of God. So, those two arguments from evil, the argument from divine hiddenness and the argument from superfluous evil, because they're probabilistic, aren't any good against my case for God. However, I don't want to quite stop it there. I think that is sufficient to answer those two objections. But just to kind of, that's not a very, I think, satisfying answer for most people. Because they say, Thomas, like, sure, they're just probabilistic, but they're still strong arguments. And I want to propose a few just quick little things to help you maybe see how it could be the case that these arguments fail. First, I want to say that we have to remember that God is all-knowing, like we said. That means that God knows infinitely more than we do. So in his providence, he might see some kind of greater good that can be brought about by the existence of animal suffering or the existence of a non-resistant non-believer, an atheist who sincerely is convinced that God does not exist, that we do not see. He sees the full consequence of allowing the evil to exist, and we're trying to guess what possible reasons you could have. And he might be up there looking at us like, guys, you just don't see the full picture. You can't possibly get this. That applies, I think, to both arguments. To address the problem of superfluous evil, and especially the animal suffering part of that in particular, I think it's easy sometimes in our Disney-fied era to look at animals and think that they suffer like human beings suffer. They certainly feel pain, that's for sure. But I think it's very likely that animals do not feel the kind of pain that we do because they're not rational. They don't have the ability, for example, to reflect rationally on their pain and agonize over it. They just feel it as a bodily sensation, and that's it. So when we look at the millions of years of animal suffering, we have to keep that in mind. It's not suffering like we associate it in our lives. Second, and this is kind of a funny point, I always think when the atheist says that we have no idea that God could prevent the deer in the forest from feeling pain as that tree presses down on him, I would say one of two things. I would say, first, I think that still relates to human beings. Because it could be that a human being one day finds that deer laying on the ground and says, and if God had prevented that deer from feeling pain, there could be empirical evidence of it. And that would disturb us having these logical laws of nature, which I think are so important for us being able to trust our senses. We need to have laws of nature which are generally consistent and make sense. And if we saw that, like when deers have trees fall on them, the laws of nature just stop working, I think we would see that something weird's going on here. I don't think God operates that way. And then the atheist might say, well, what about a situation where, this is more of a joke than anything else, what about a situation where God knows that no human being will ever find the body of that deer and piece together anything like that? And then I would just say, how do you know that he hasn't prevented the deer from feeling pain in that specific situation? If you're talking about a situation where it's guaranteed that no human being will ever find any evidence of God preventing this deer from feeling pain, well, how do you know he hasn't done that? And I'm way over now, so I'll just say when it comes to the problem of divine hiddenness, I think that being is the proper effect of God's action. So I think any way that God could reveal himself would be phony in comparison to just causing beings to exist. And that, again, both of those answers to the objections are more focused on they're ancillary books. The main point that I want to raise here is that we do not have any. Those are probabilistic arguments against God, and probabilistic arguments do not work against the certain arguments of God that I presented in this presentation. Thank you.